Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to review a few books. Okay, I'm going to talk about my collection of Beatles books, and I'm going to have to split this video into a few, I think, because there's too much to get through. And I was I didn't really know where to start because there's so many books here. So I'm going to have a go. Now, I would, first of all, before I start, I'm going to divide the books. I think one can divide Beatles books into various categories. One is what I would call in their own words, which is stuff written by the Beatles themselves, and that would include interviews. And as you'll see later on, I'm actually including interview records as kind of audio books. So I will count them as contenders for the top 10 books when I come to do that. So in their own words is one category. And then what I would call picture books, which basically rely on a series of pictures from the times, and they could either be by professional photographers or people who got lucky, or otherwise. I'll show you a few examples of that. And the third category is what I call reference books, which is detailing what the Beatles got up to every day, month, year that they were together or apart. And then we have another category which I would call musical analysis, and also analysing the cultural impact of the Beatles, and there's a few of those. And then there's a whole load of books written by insiders, what I would call insiders. So we've got wives, girlfriends, employees, and not too many of them will feature in my top 10 list, but I might do a separate video just on those insider books actually, because there's a few good ones. So before I get to the top 10, I'm going to start off with books about the group, and I'll probably cover the solo years in later videos. So before I come to the top 10, I'm just going to show you a few outliers which didn't quite make the top 10. So this is what I would call a reference book. This is by Jeffrey Giliano. And it's pretty decent, but I mean, all he's done, I think, is just taking pictures of his record collection, which is always nice for the fan to see. You know, album sleeves, single sleeves, and also memorabilia as well. He's got a lot of stuff, and he's very knowledgeable. I think George Harrison once said that Jeffrey Giliano knows more about him than he himself does. So that's one. And then an example of what I call a picture book is The Beatles in Rishikesh, which is written by an American guy who just happened to be there at the time and had his camera with him and shot some decent pictures. I think this is probably the most memorable picture, which is in the book as well, featuring all four Beatles sitting at the foot of the Maharishi. So that's a nice one. This comes under the category of reference book. This is Kevin Howlett's BBC, documenting the BBC sessions, which is very nice, very good companion to the CDs that we have, volume 1 and 2. And then also under picture book category is this big book by Robert Freeman. And this was given to me by a friend many years ago. You know who you are, thank you. And as you go through this book, I mean, the front cover is the front cover of with the Beatles, and then as you go through the book, you think, he did that as well, because he was also responsible for the cover of Hard Day's Night, and the cover of Beatles' Sail, and that was an outtake from that session. And then a lot of pictures at the filming of Help. This is the Beatles having breakfast in the snow, or lunch, with the boiled eggs. It's quite interesting. And then, if you ever want a picture of the Beatles underwater, here it is. That's pretty unusual. And then, you know, various other iconic images, like this picture of Paul from the back cover of Help. And he also was responsible for the Hard Day's Night cover, which is in here, and the Rubber Soul cover, which is not, for some reason. Another good example of a reference book is this one by Neville Standard, invaluable book going through all the Beatles releases, and there's another one on the solo years. It includes chart positions, date of release, B-sides. Excellent, love this type of book. And then this one talks about the music, A Day in the Life, by Mark Hertzgaard. Very, very incisive book, very well written, and I found myself agreeing with 95% of what he's writing here. So this was unlucky not to make the top 10. So with that, I will come to the top 10. Just before I start that, I will say that this book, Tune In, is volume 1 of 3 by Mark Lewis, and when he's completed volumes 2 and 3, which is going to take another 10 years, I think, because volume 2 is not even due out till 2020. When he's completed all 3, I'm sure it will be number 1 on my list. But as it is, we only have volume 1, which goes up to New Year's Eve 1962. So it's incomplete, so it's not qualified for the top 10 in my list today. But as with everything Mark Lewison does, his attention to detail is incredible, and he will go down in history as the best Beatles biographer for sure. Having said that, someone needs to help him on the cover design, because this had a dust jacket, which I got rid of because it was even worse than this. Someone needs to help him with coming up with a better cover. But apart from that, that's the only criticism I can even think of. So, on to the top 10. So, maybe some of you might be surprised that this is not going to be higher in the list. But it is the Beatles Anthology, which came out in the mid-90s. And basically it's got loads of stuff in here, written by all 4 Beatles and Neil Aspinall and Derek Taylor and a couple of others. It's chock-a-block full of great stuff. The only slight reservation I have, well, one, it's huge. It's not the kind of book you can take on the bus with you, but it's a coffee table book. But the only slight reservation I have is a lot of the interviews from Paul, George and Ringo for this project were with the benefit of 30 years of hindsight. And I think that sometimes distorts one's memory, and hence some of their views maybe are with the benefit of hindsight rather than what they said at the time. So I tend to prefer interview material at the time to stuff looking back. But having said that, it's invaluable. I wouldn't be without it. So number 9 is that. Number 10 is that. Number 9 is Off the Record, which is another reference book. Keith Badman does an outstanding job going through all the events at the time by date. He did a similar volume on the solo years. And the one advantage this has over the anthology, in my opinion, is it includes quotes from the time, from all 4 Beatles. So, for example, if we're talking about Help, it's got a quote from John in 1965 rather than in 1980, or in the case of Paul as well, rather than a recent interview. It's how they felt at the time, and that's why it's called Unrehearsed Interviews, Off the Record, Outrageous Opinions. There's nothing too outrageous in here, but it's a blooming good read and very invaluable for any Beatles fan. Number 8 is this. I cannot believe how dull this cover is, because this is the book of July the 28th, 1968, when this guy, Don McCullum, went round London and photographed the Beatles. And there's so many great photos in this book and in these sessions. You'd think he'd put one on the cover, but he didn't. But anyway, I love this book, and I think I was waiting for years for it to come out, and I'm really glad it did. And the locations they use are very interesting. There's a session in Wapping, there's a session in Hampstead in North London, there's a bit inside by a piano with Paul with a parrot on his shoulder. Very iconic images, and the gatefold inside picture of the Red and the Blue album with them looking through the railings was also taken on this day. So it was round about the time of the White Album being recorded and just before the trouble set in, so in that way it's nice to see the four of them together, for the most part smiling, not always, and just classic. There's the parrot picture. And I wish they'd come up with a similar volume for August the 22nd, 1969, the Beatles' final photo shoot at Tittenhurst Park, because that would make a great book as well. There's many iconic pictures from that day, the front and back cover of Hey Jude, for example. So that's a great book. Number 7 is Revolution in the Head from Ian MacDonald, and when this came out it was a revelation. It was kind of the first of its kind because he analyses every song in a lot of detail. He writes well, he knows what he's talking about, and he points out what he thinks are the weaknesses and the strengths of the various songs, and for the most part it's pretty sound. It's just occasionally his opinions are, well, inevitably in a volume like this you're not going to agree with everything he says. So for example, his views on Birthday, Helter Skelter, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Your Mother Should Know, Across the Universe, Maxwell Silverhammer, his views on all of those songs are pretty negative, and that is quite annoying. But I recommend it, because when it's the rest of it's pretty good. That was number 7. Number 6 is quite an old book from Nicholas Schaffner called The Beatles Forever. This guy sadly passed away at a young age. One of the first Beatles books I ever got. As you can see, it's it's falling apart, but it's I think the pages are still here. It's just I need to get it rebound or something. And this covers not only the group years, but it goes up to 1976 and the solo years, and very amusingly written. And I think that counts for a lot in a Beatles book. Whereas this book contains virtually no humour at all. Nicholas Schaffner is making wry comments throughout, and to the great benefit of this book. He can tell he's a fan, but when he doesn't like an album, he's not afraid to say so. And I love this book. I wish it was still in print, but I don't think it is. Number 5, The Beatles, London. This is a brilliant book, particularly if you live in London, maybe, because you can actually go around London with this book and check out the various locations, not only Abbey Road, which is on the front, but the whole of the Mad Day Out from July 68, which was in the book I showed you a minute ago. All of those sessions are detailed in here in enormous detail. I mean, you can literally trace the movements because they have little maps and stuff, and dates. West Malling is where they filmed Mystery Tour, so it includes the stuff in Kent and outside London, like Tittenhurst Park is in here. The boat club in Twickenham, where the picture of the Beatles with the white Rolls Royce from April '69 is in here. I think Derek Taylor does the foreword and says it's the most interesting Beatles book. He doesn't say it's the best Beatles book, but he says it's the most interesting, and I think he's right. It's it's number 4 on my list, or 5. Number 4. And I was debating whether to count this as a Beatles book or a solo book or whatever, because it's a bit of both, but it's a classic, and it's Ringo Starr's Postcards from the Boys, and this came out a few years ago, and basically it's a collection of all the postcards he received over the years from John, Paul and George, and it's a mixture of stuff in the mid-60s and goes through to stuff he received in the 70s as well. It's just very moving. This one is from John at the time of the court case, and John's just asking who'd have thought it would come to this, which is kind of sad. There's another one where Paul's saying you're the best rock and roll drummer in the world, around the time of Let It Be. And there's also another one where John is recommending Ringo to record Blondie, Heart of Glass, that type of song he thought would be good material for Ringo. And this was the time when he was in his 5-year sabbatical, so very interesting. And great commentary from Ringo on each postcard, great reminiscences. I love this book, and very well packaged, lovely picture on the front which changes, I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but it changes from Ringo to the Fab Four. So, love that book. Number 3 is Roy Carr and Tony Tyler, Beatles Illustrated Record, again one of the first Beatles books I ever had. It goes through each album and it reviews the singles, the albums, starting from the beginning and going up to the solo years, and this particular edition goes up to Double Fantasy and John's death. And again, the same with the Nicholas Schaffner book, very well written with a lot of humour. And even when you're disagreeing with some of these reviews, like for example, this book is very harsh on George Harrison. Doesn't even like All Things Must Pass, if you can believe that. And it's very harsh on some of Paul's albums, like Back to the Egg, London Town. But it's written with such great humour that you can forgive these guys anything. It's a wonderful book, and again, I wish this was in print, because this deserves to be a timeless book. In fact, it is a timeless book, even if not everyone realises it. So that's number 3. Number 2 is, I'm going to put these books together because they belong together, I think. Mark Lewis and Recording Sessions and Beatles Chronicle. Kind of overlapping. The first book just has recording sessions and the second book has recording sessions plus live concerts and stuff. And this came out in 1988, and it just goes through all the sessions and tells you what they recorded on each day and who played what. It's just an absolutely brilliant book, and Mark Lewis has said recently in an interview he gets so much praise for this book, but he hasn't even looked at it since he wrote it. Well, it deserves again to go down in history as one of the greatest Beatles books. I think it will, actually, along with his his definitive biography of the Beatles, the 3-part one. I think this is just amazing, and very good interviews with the engineers who were there at the time. Just full of fascinating detail. Great. So number 1 now we come to, and this is a little bit controversial. I'm cheating a bit, as I said at the beginning. I'm going to include interview discs as what I would call audio books, and this album I picked up very early on in my Beatles appreciation years, back in 1978 I think. And this was interviews with which David Wigg did, who's from the Daily Express. And so this is him interviewing Paul in 1969. And then we've got some great pictures, and pictures of him interviewing John somewhere here as well. Yeah, at the bottom there you can see him interviewing John and Yoko. And what's fascinating about this album is each Beatle is interviewed in 1969, 1970, around the time of the Beatles split. And what's fascinating is none of them are confirming that they're splitting up at all, which makes an important point. I think all these documentaries now, including the anthology, said, oh yeah, they knew Abbey Road was going to be the last album, blah blah. But I think at the time it was more fluid, and they didn't really know what was going on, and they were confused, as the general public later became. And it's very candid listening to these interviews, especially Ringo, the one from 1970, saying they're all good pals and we like to play together, and you always hurt the one you love and we all love each other. Great, moving. And George Harrison himself, who is normally the most negative, saying you can't split, it's impossible, or maybe to physically split is impossible, but to spiritually split is impossible, because if you're listening, I'm the walrus too. So that came from George. Amazing. Some of the dates of these interviews on the back are actually factually incorrect, which was corrected by Kevin Howlett in his BBC book, because these interviews actually came out, even though David Wood was from the Daily Express, they were broadcast on the BBC radio at the time. Another one to point out is the October 71 interview with John, where he famously says, talks about the Beatles split and saying it's only a rock group that split up, it's nothing important. You have all the records there if you want to reminisce. And he just goes on this tirade, we're making far better music now because we're not so suppressed. And he compares it to a rugby team. It's like a rugby team. Sometimes you have to go off and get married and leave the boys on a Saturday night, and that's how it is. So check out that interview and check this album out. It's just brilliant. And I'm going to put that number one as a kind of audio book. Okay, later videos will follow on the solo years, etc. Thank you for watching. See you next time.